Hello, and welcome to The Portmanteaus. I'm your host, Paul Bunyan. In this episode, we will discuss the poem by Wallace Stevens called Anecdote of the Jar. Here with me today is my guest, Guthrie. So, the poem is relatively short, and it goes like this. I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wilderness rose up to it, and sprawled around no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground, and tall and of a port in air. It took dominion everywhere. The jar was grey and bare. It did not give of bird or bush, like nothing else in Tennessee. Personally, I feel that this poem accurately represents how the change in an environment will affect our personalities as people. This jar originally was round and tall, and it retains those qualities after being in the wilderness for so long, but it is also different, surrounded by wilderness and not nothingness. Though at its core, it is the same jar. Placing it in a new environment changed it, for better or for worse.
We are going to discuss some of the literary techniques used by Wallace Stevens to create tension. Interestingly, the poem is impersonating iambic tetrameter. Iambic tetrameter is originated with classical Greek poetry, and Stevens is calling us back to our literary origins. This means that there are 4 beats of one unstressed syllable followed by one stressed syllable. However, the rhythm breaks up by the 3rd line. It made the slovenly wilderness, and by the 4th line, it is completely gone. Surround that hill. This intentional break in form represents the idea that life is irregular and cannot be confined or expressed in a small, orderly jar. By the 4th line, Wallace Stevens is creating tension that we all feel. Another interesting literary technique is the use of the sejura. A sejura is a stop in the metric line or phrase. In almost every single line of the poem, there are 8 syllables. However, the 4th line is only a half line, and the 10th line only has 6 syllables. The almost successful attempts to restrict the verse this way furthers the idea of humans trying to force order into a complex world. Lastly, Stephen uses careful word choice. He describes the wilderness as slovenly, personifying it with human characteristics. Additionally, the poem is mellifluous and sonorous with the repetition of the sound round. This builds upon the circular story of the jar, which begins and ends with the phrase, in Tennessee. All of the choices made by Stevens build upon the themes that Anecdote of a Jar is expressing. Oftentimes in poetry, the reader can choose the interpretation that makes sense to them. In our case, we thought that the poem represents humans trying to control the environment. Another interesting interpretation that one can make is that humans need to create anecdotes or stories to process information. A jar cannot actually physically do anything, but this story, told from a first-person narrative, is trying to convince the reader that something is happening. In other words, humans need to find meaning. Finally, Stevens' work must be viewed in comparison with the Ode to the Grecian Urn by John Keats. In Keats' poem, the context of art on an immortal Grecian urn is discussed. However, in Anecdote of the Jar is described as grey and bare. Stevens is imagining a situation in which we don't discuss the jar. Rather, we witness the wilderness it changes with its presence.
I find this poem to be wonderfully odd, as the randomness of a jar in Tennessee makes the reader confused, but in a way that eases the reader into the topic, as it is something new that the reader has never experienced before. This also relates to the poem, as the randomness of it can be seen as a new environment, essentially making the reader that jar in Tennessee. The same can be said for the rhythm of the poem. As mentioned before, and as you could certainly tell while Paul was reading the poem, it is extremely offbeat and off-putting, which, much like the odd setting of the poem, hits the reader like a ton of bricks, as the reader is encompassed in an entirely different world.
I also appreciate how the openness of the poem leaves so much to interpretation, and how many interpretations can be drawn from, even with so little detail. For example, if seen from a feminist viewpoint, the jar represents a male id, and is placed in a seemingly female environment, that of Mother Nature. This shows how if a male person is placed in a female environment, it will disrupt the domain and cause discord.
Okay, I see your point of view, but I have to disagree with it. If we're speaking from this feminist point of view, I don't think that the jar is disrupting the female environment. I think that in this case, what we're seeing is that the male id is not being disrupted by the female environment, showing the ignorance of males and their refusal to see things from a female perspective.
That's really interesting, Paul. This is an example of how a poet's text can be interpreted in many different ways. Another great example is that this poem could represent concerns about our climate crisis. The jar represents man-made problems that are destroying the natural world. Essentially, there are no correct answers in poetry. Wallace Stevens was born in Reading, Pennsylvania in 1879. He attended Harvard and graduated with a law degree from New York Law School in 1903. For the next 13 years, he would practice law. During this part of his life, Stevens was interested in the literary community. Under the pseudonym Peter Parasol, he actually wrote entries for the poetry magazine competition. In 1916, Stevens moved to Connecticut, where he became an executive in an insurance company. Throughout the rest of his life, Stevens would lead a quiet existence, composing poems on his way to work every day. He wrote Anecdote of a Jar in 1918, while in Elizabethtown, Tennessee. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. Anecdote of the Jar can be found on Poetry Foundation and In Harmonium. Soundtrap was used in the making of this podcast and the creation of the score. Information about Wallace Stevens was obtained from poets.org. For more literary fun, read some Wallace Stevens, Robert Frost, or William Blake.
Recorded by Hells Yeah Studio. This was an Audible original.